I'm recording my homily for the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. I've always been jealous of people who are really at peace. In other words, they're very flexible. So no matter what's happening in their life, things are going good, things are going bad, they always seem to just kind of flow with what is happening. They're flexible in that they're very much at peace with life. They're not the ones who are going to stir the pot or going to make trouble. I've always been kind of jealous of that because that is not me. I like to control things. The engineering side of me, I want to fix things, right? Things can always be better. And that's not necessarily always good, right? Or it's not always bad either, but there's parts of it too sometimes that can be very frustrating. But what I want to say today is that at least in the last 2-3 years of Jesus' life, there was on some level a sense for Jesus that he was seeking something more, that there was some uneasiness, and maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but when he would encounter people, when he would go into their lives, he was always seeking something deeper for them. He was always looking for transformation. He wanted to heal, he wanted to help, he wanted to transform, or as we may say, he wanted to redeem, right? And those are all beautiful things. But because of that, you get a sense as you read through the Gospels, even from the very beginning, when he began his ministry, there's always an element of the cross that he's carrying. Because there's always something he's striving for in the brokenness of a person's life. And the closer we get to Jesus, I think the more we realize how just passionate he is about trying to redeem us. I want you to take that as we apply it to the gospel for today, because I think that's important to understand it, at least in the way I'm going to explain it. I can't say the way I'm going to explain the gospel today is correct, because I think I'm going out on the limb a little bit, but at the very least, to understand it, maybe it'll make more sense, okay? So let's go in the gospel for today. Now the gospel today, it seems like Jesus is giving very practical advice, almost like an intervention, right? I don't know if you've ever done an intervention with somebody in your family where somebody has an addiction, somebody has a problem, somebody's doing something really bad that's affecting others. And so you decide to intervene. You go and you talk to them. So here's the format that Jesus lays out for this. He says, if your brother sins against you, okay, if your brother is doing something really bad, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Very good practical advice. When somebody's doing something bad, we don't want to humiliate them. We don't want to bring it in front of everybody and embarrass them. We don't want to put it on Facebook. That's just passive aggressive, right? So true love, say, okay, I'm going to go to my brother, I'm going to go to this person, one-on-one, and see if we can't find a way to work through it. And so the root of that is love. It's not judgment. You may be rendering a judgment on the person's actions, but it's not judgment, it is love. Okay? All right. Then Jesus says, but if that doesn't work, then you need to not give up. You need to keep striving a little bit. And so then you bring in a couple other people who can act as witnesses, who can give some bolster to your argument or your point of view, and perhaps that strength will then convince the person that, okay, yes, there's a problem here, and I need to seek some help. Okay, I need to get some kind of help, okay? All right, this is great practical advice. Sometimes we have to do that with people we love. Sometimes we need that, right? Sometimes we have our blinders on, and we can't see something that we're doing. And it takes a couple people to say, hey, what's going on here? Okay. If that doesn't work, then Jesus says, okay, if that doesn't work, bring them to the church. Now, here the word church means literally the assembly. So bring them to the assembly. So in other words, open it up and say, there's something serious going on here, and we can't let it just be a secret any longer because this is not good. Okay? Now, what are a couple examples of that? Well, sometimes people will call me up as a priest and say, Father, I need you to talk to my kid. Well, that's kind of like bringing it to the church, because as a priest, I kind of represent in some ways the community when we don't necessarily have the community all there, right? In fact, in the sacrament of reconciliation, we say that the priest in confession, he not only represents Jesus Christ, as the head of the body, but the priest also represents the body of the church. So the person doesn't have to confess their sins openly. So the priest acts on behalf of the people to reconcile that person with the church. That's why we say the person is in communion with the body of Christ and the head, Jesus, when they receive absolution for their sins. Okay, so the hope is that you bring them to the church, and let's say one of the ways you can do that, you say, hey, look, you really need to go to confession. This is just really bad. You really need to go to confession. But what if that doesn't work? What if the person is just not open to it? So then Jesus gives a last step, if you will. And this is the one that caught my attention, and this is what I'm going to focus on, okay? If he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would treat a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, he ends it there. He doesn't really say what that means. He goes on to talk about binding and loosing, which are all, that's spiritual language, spiritual theology language for confession, right? Being reconciled. But he says, if he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, when I'm hearing that, I'm hearing, okay, 3 strikes, you're out, right? We tried those 3 steps. It didn't work. Write them off. Treat them as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Remember the Gentiles, the tax collectors, they were the people on the fringe. They were the outsiders. Treat them as you would those. Just write them off. Is that what Jesus is saying? That's the question I'm posing. Because that's what it sounds like. Now, if that's what Jesus is saying, then I say, I like that. Because that's easy. I can do that, right? That doesn't require any love. It doesn't require the cross. You don't even have to believe in God to do that. But does that sound like Jesus? Or is there something hidden in that? Is there something deeper that to the person who really understood Jesus would realize there's actually a very different meaning in that? Let's give it a try. Now, the first way we interpret it, we write the person off. We're done. We've had enough. I'm out of here, right? The problem is there's no cross in that. That's not Jesus. If there's no cross, it's not Jesus. You can't have the resurrection without the cross, right? We know that. Now, let me ask you a question. How did Jesus treat the Gentiles and the tax collectors? Because then that would tell us the ideal way to handle this last step. How did he treat them? Did he write them off? How did Jesus treat the tax collectors? Well, what gospel did we just read from? What gospel have we been working through for the last few weeks, few months? The Gospel of Matthew, right? Now, what was Matthew's previous occupation before he met Jesus? He was a tax collector. So the person who wrote this was a tax collector. Now, can you imagine Matthew writing this down and saying, oh yeah, just treat him as you would, just write him off? No, that can't be, right? There's something deeper Jesus is saying. Why did he say Gentile and tax collector? What did he do with tax collector? Well, Matthew. Now, do you think he just met Matthew in the produce section of Safeway? No, he sought him out. Everybody hated Matthew. Matthew would have been one who everybody would have recognized in the community because everybody would have had contact with him, right? And don't think of an IRS, don't think of the Internal Revenue Service, right? This isn't a tax collectors. No, this is a mafia-style tax collecting. This is having an enforcer, right? This is where the Roman army is the enforcer, and there's often brutality and corruption all mixed in. They would have considered Matthew as a traitor to the Jewish people. So anyways, Jesus seeks him out because he's lost. He's the one who's the sinner. And so maybe this 4th step is saying, okay, you tried those logical things And in some ways, those first three steps don't really require a whole lot of faith and really not even a ton of love, not even really the cross. But that fourth step is going deeper. It's driving in and it's saying, here's where you need grace. Here's where you need the cross. Because this is where reason is not going to work. This is where it's just going to be brutal love. It's just going to be persevering in the midst of something very ugly. It's digging down deep. It's like being the surgeon who's seeking the cancer out. And the little topical lotion didn't work, right? It's time to do surgery. I think maybe that's what Jesus is implying. We have other examples of that where Jesus encountered other tax collectors, right? And what did he do? He said, let me go to your home to dine. Let me into your life so that I can bring transformation. In fact, some of the most beautiful examples of transformation happened by tax collectors who said, Lord, if I've wronged anybody, I will give back fourfold what I've done. Well, that's beautiful. How about Gentiles, though? Let's move on to Gentiles. How did Jesus treat the Gentiles? Well, there's a pretty tough example of that we had just a couple weeks ago. It was, let me tell you, it was the 20th Sunday of Ordinary Time, and that's when Jesus encounters the Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus asking for Jesus to heal her daughter. And you remember that interaction. It's kind of a brutal one, right, at first, because Jesus is throwing back in her face all the cultural prejudices and norms and racisms and everything there that exists between the people. And it's like he wants to see, can she transcend this? Is her faith great enough to transcend everything that would hinder her from really being open to Jesus? Or is she just trying to manipulate Jesus to get something? Is she truly humble? And so she goes to Jesus and begs him for help. And how does he respond? He says, no, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, there's something even in that statement. I won't go there. There's something even in that statement, though, that's cloaked, that maybe implies that he wants to help her. Because he's talking about the lost sheep, right? Okay, I won't go, that's a rabbit trail. I won't go down that path. All right. And then he says, and she says, Lord, help me. Help me. And he says to her, it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. You're a dog. I mean, no, he's not saying that any more than he's saying that you're to write the Gentiles and the tax collectors off. See, I think there's just something beautifully hidden within the fullness of the meaning of these stories that Jesus has, that only a person who truly is seeking God's will would get to that point. Jesus is rather clever. He in some sense, I'd say he's like a philosopher who knows how to throw up error so that people can see it for what it is, and then he can shoot it down, right? And so that's what he does here. And so what does she say? So he's beckoning this out of her. Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters. She destroyed all of those cultural norms, all of those things that people just accepted. And then he says, "A woman, great is your faith." A woman, great is your faith. Almost every single person that he says, "Oh, great is your faith," was not a Jewish person. It was an outsider. It was somebody who was lost. It was a lost sheep. Treat him as you would treat a Gentile or a tax collector. Cross, right? Don't give up on him. It's the cross. It means we need to change tactics. It doesn't mean that we become the doormat, right? Being the doormat is not love. Being passive is not love. Love is very active. Love confronts evil. But it does it in love, obviously, not in judgment. This is the context where when Jesus says to love your enemy, this is the context where that bears out. in this interpretation that I'm offering you, that makes perfect sense. Love my enemy. Yes, because the Gentile and the tax collector, they're my enemy. I need to love them. That's the fourth step. There's a poem, and I got to be honest with you, when I read it, I don't completely understand it. But there's a poem called The Hound from Heaven. You know, if you do a Google search where you just type in the hound from ... right? The first couple options is the hound from hell. But there's a poem called The Hound from Heaven. So usually when you think of the hounds, you think of this dog chasing, hunting down. You think of Satan, right? Who's on our heels, who wants to tear us down, who wants to destroy us. And so he wrote this Christian man wrote this very creative poem where he talks about God, and he says, no, God is far more of one who loves than Satan. Satan doesn't have not even a tiny bit of the passion that Jesus has to pursue us. And so Jesus is this hound from heaven who's constantly going after those who are fallen, those who are seeking. And the poem begins with, I flee, I flee, I flee. I'm fleeing God. I'm turning to bad things. And Jesus is the hound, keeps coming and coming, and he never gives up. He never gives up. He never impedes our free will, but he never gives up. There's a quote from Pope Francis that has been used a lot lately, and I just want to give one take on it because I think it's often misquoted, it's taken out of context, it's misused, and it's used now, I think, to represent something very dark. And so the quote from Pope Francis was, "Who am I to judge?" Right? So somebody asked him about a priest who's perhaps gay or homosexual, but he's faithful to the priest. He's being a good priest. He's not sinning, if you will. And he said, well, who am I to judge? Well, that's been taken out of context numerous times. But you know, the context that I think it's being used now, it's not who am I to judge, but people are using it more like, who am I to care? Who am I to care if my brother's doing something bad? It's not my business. So we say, well, who am I to judge? I'm so loving, right? I'm so great. Who am I to judge? But really what we're saying is, I don't really want to care. If that person wants to go off and do all their stuff, who am I to care? Am I my brother's keeper? Is it my responsibility? So those were the words of Cain, right? After he killed his brother. I want to offer an example of the kind of love that Jesus, I think, is getting at here, where again, it's not judgment, but it is love. And it is love that confronts evil. Because our culture, when they use Pope Francis' words, they're not talking about confronting evil. They're just talking about being ambivalent. They're talking about, in a sense, anarchy. Who am I to do anything when there's evil? I don't care. So the example is St. Peter Claver. St. Peter Claver, we just had his feast day 2 days ago. And St. Peter Claver was a Jesuit back in the day when the Jesuits were they were superheroes. They were just such great examples of courageous love. So he was raised in Spain, and he joined the Jesuits, and then when he completed his formation, I should say, as he was doing his formation, he was sent down to Colombia into the New World, and where he became a priest, and he spent his whole life serving. The thing was, in Colombia at the time, was the slave trade was going on. It would be like their version of the drug trade. And back then, they would go to Africa, and you have these tribal wars going on in Africa, and when one tribe won, they would enslave the people of the other tribe, and then they would sell them to these New World slave traders for a lot of money, or maybe even a little bit of money, and then they would take the slaves to the New World, and this is where, as the United States, this is where our shame should come and prick our conscience, because back then the United States and Brazil were the two largest traders of slaves. We are the two largest importers of slaves. And isn't it ironic that today we are one of the largest importers of illegal drugs, which comes from where? From Colombia, right? Okay, that's another rabbit trail. I won't go down that path. So St. Peter, Father Peter Claver, is in Colombia while these ships are coming into port just loaded with African slaves. And he realizes immediately that this is a horrible, horrible thing. There's an injustice here. There's a betrayal of love. There's a betrayal of Jesus Christ as one who created us and loves us. And so he refuses to allow that darkness just to keep going. He could have said, well, who am I to judge, right? He could have said that. Who am I to judge? It's not my deal, right? We do that with abortion all the time. Well, who am I to judge? Well, so he didn't judge, but he also said, I'm not going to go along with this garbage. So he's every day, day in and day out, he would just gather the things he could gather, a little bit of food, some clothing, whatever he could scrounge up. He would go down to the docks. He would go into the ship holds. He would go and he would seek out the sickest of the people, those who were close to dying. And every single day, he would go there to nurture them and to pray with them. And he didn't just give them material things. He didn't just give them food and clothing. As Jesus says, we do not live by bread alone. But he began to teach them. And he began to teach them about Jesus Christ. He began to teach them about something that would give them hope. Because when they were brought, the slave traders told them that they were coming over here to be eaten. Can you imagine that? I mean, that's just cruel. That's absolutely cruel. And so he would go in, St. Peter, Father Peter, would go in, and he would say, no, Jesus Christ died for you. There is hope. He did that for 40 years. Now the thing is, he never got a following. He never got a mob of people crying for social justice. He was battling the cultural norm. The Christians, the non-Christians, the greedy, they all went along with it. He refused. And so he did it alone. He had the help of a few people. He had translators to help him with translating. But when it came time for him and he was dying, he died in isolation. He died in absolute dire poverty. There was a slave that was appointed to take care of him by the order, and this slave just abused him. And you know what Father Peter said? He said, well, it's helping me to work through my own sinfulness. It's helping me to repent of my own sinfulness. But the thing was, when he died, people all of a sudden began to realize that the whole time they had had Jesus Christ in their midst. Every single day he was down there on the docks and they ignored him. Every day he was ministering to the people whom Jesus loves, the Gentiles and the tax collectors, the lost, the people who nobody else was loving, the people who everybody else had given up on, the people who thought that they weren't even fully human, right? That's what we do with our unborn. They're not fully human. So day in and day out, people just ignored it. Said, who am I to judge? Father Peter refused. But it took his death to wake the people up. And after he had died, there was such an overwhelming sentiment of I guess, I don't even call it repentance, openness to what he had done, that by the time they were getting ready to have his funeral, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people there. And after he had died, people started to fight. People started to say, he was right, and we were wrong. So I use that as an example of our story of the gospel today. And what Jesus, I think, is getting at. When he says, treat him as you would a Gentile or tax collector, he's saying, it's time to trust God, and it's time not to give up. All right? God bless.